When World War II finally ended, the entire planet just breathed this collective sigh of relief. But that peace, it wasn't going to last. A brand new kind of conflict was already brewing, a nearly half-century standoff that would come to define the modern world, the Cold War.
So, here's the big question, right? How did two nations that fought side by side to take down Hitler become such bitter enemies? What happened that turned these allies into rivals who brought us all to the very brink of nuclear annihilation? Well, that's the incredible story we're going to unpack today.
You see, this wasn't a war of guns and tanks, not at first anyway. It was a war of ideas. It was a fundamental, deep-down disagreement about the right way to build the world after the war. And as the dust settled on the ruins of Europe, two completely different visions for the future came into focus.
And this slide really breaks it down for us. On one side, you've got the American vision. Capitalism, democracy, free markets, all centered on individual rights. And on the other side, the Soviet model. Communism, a one-party state, a state-controlled economy, all about the power of the collective. These weren't just, different economic policies. They were completely opposing philosophies on how human society should work. And honestly, they were never going to coexist peacefully.
For the U.S., the thinking was actually pretty straightforward. Countries that trade together, that are prosperous, well, they don't tend to start wars with each other. Their goal was to create this huge network of capitalist democracies, all trading freely. It was a vision of security through shared economic success.
The Soviets, though, they saw security through a completely different lens. For them, it was all about territory. And you have to remember, they had lost over 20 million people in World War II. Their country had been absolutely leveled by invasions. So their number one non-negotiable priority was creating a protective barrier, a buffer zone of friendly communist states in Eastern Europe to make sure Russia could never be invaded from the West again.
So you can see where this is going, right? These two very different ideas of what security meant, they were on a collision course. And the first point of impact was the continent of Europe, which was about to be literally torn in two. And in 1946, Winston Churchill gave this new reality its iconic name, the Iron Curtain. Now, it wasn't a physical wall just yet, but it was an incredibly powerful metaphor for this new, harsh dividing line, political, ideological, and soon physical, that was separating East from West.
And what's really staggering when you look at this timeline is just the sheer speed of it all. I mean, in just a few short years after the war ended, with the Soviet Red Army stationed all across the region, one Eastern European country after another just fell under the control of Soviet-backed communist governments. It was like dominoes falling, one by one.
So the West's response comes in 1947, and it's a big one. It's called the Truman Doctrine. And it was basically a promise, a declaration to the world that the U.S. would support any free nation resisting a communist takeover. This new policy had a name, a single word that would drive American foreign policy for the next 40 years: containment.
The very first major test of containment happened right here, in the city of Berlin. Now, the city was deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, but the western half was run by the Allies. So the Soviets tried to starve West Berlin into submission, cutting off all road and rail access. But the West's response was incredible. They didn't send an army, they launched the Berlin Airlift, supplying an entire city from the sky for almost a year. It was a massive logistical miracle and an even bigger political victory.
After the Berlin crisis, the lines weren't just political anymore. They became militarized. In 1949, the West formed NATO, a defensive alliance with a simple promise: an attack on one is an attack on all. And a few years later, the Soviet Union responded with its own military bloc, the Warsaw Pact, locking down its control over the armies of Eastern Europe. The continent was now, officially, two armed camps staring each other down.
With Europe locked down and divided, both superpowers were extremely careful not to provoke a direct fight. I mean, the stakes were just too high. But that doesn't mean the fighting stopped. Oh no. The Cold War was about to get very, very hot as the battle for global influence spread to every corner of the planet.
And they did this through something called proxy wars. This was the main strategy, really. Instead of fighting each other head-on, Washington and Moscow would just pick opposing sides in a local civil war or a regional conflict. They'd pour in weapons, money, and advisors, essentially turning these local struggles into deadly extensions of their own global rivalry.
And just look at this list. It really shows you how this conflict went global. From Korea to Vietnam, the Congo to Angola, to Afghanistan, local conflicts were hijacked by superpower competition. The entire world, in a very real way, became a chessboard for their deadly game.
Let's just use the Angolan Civil War as a perfect case study. What started as a local fight for independence from Portugal quickly got way more complicated. You had the Marxist MPLA backed by the Soviets in Cuba. Then you had two anti-communist factions, the FNLA and UNITA, both getting weapons and money from the United States. A local power struggle became a battlefield for the Cold War.
But for all the real, tragic bloodshed in these proxy wars, there was a much bigger fear always lurking in the background: the threat of a full-scale nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union. And in October of 1962, the entire world stared right into that abyss.
Just think about that. 13 days. For 13 terrifying days in October 1962, the fate of every person on Earth hung in the balance. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis, the single moment we came closest to ending the world in a nuclear firestorm.
And it all kicked off when American spy planes flying high over Cuba brought back these absolutely shocking photos. The Soviet Union was secretly building launch sites for medium-range nuclear missiles just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. We're talking missiles that could hit Washington, D.C. in under 15 minutes.
So the standoff unfolded in these four critical stages. After the discovery, President Kennedy's advisors were screaming for an immediate airstrike. But he chose a different path. He imposed a naval blockade, he called it a quarantine, to stop any more Soviet ships from reaching Cuba. What followed was a week of the most intense, high-stakes negotiations you can possibly imagine, all happening behind the scenes while the world held its breath.
In the end, it was the secret deal that pulled the world back from the brink. The Soviets publicly agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba. In return, the U.S. promised not to invade the island. But here's the secret part. The U.S. also quietly agreed to remove its own nuclear missiles from Turkey. The crisis was a massive wake-up call, and it led to the creation of the famous Red Telephone, a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow to make sure a miscalculation like this could never happen again.
Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis was really the terrifying peak of the Cold War. For the next couple of decades, the rivalry continued, but by the 1980s, it was becoming pretty obvious that the Soviet Union was in serious trouble. The cracks in its foundation were starting to show.
It wasn't just one thing. It was like a perfect storm of problems hitting all at once. The economy had been failing for decades. They were bogged down in a disastrous, unwinnable war in Afghanistan, their version of Vietnam. And then a new, younger leader came along, Mikhail Gorbachev. His big reforms, glasnost or openness, and perestroika restructuring, were designed to save the Soviet system. But instead, they accidentally opened the floodgates of protest and nationalism. And when the end finally came, it happened with just breathtaking speed. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, that was the big symbolic moment. But after that, revolutions swept across all of Eastern Europe. Germany was reunified. And then, by December 1991, the whole thing was over. The Soviet Union itself was formally dissolved, gone from the map. On Christmas Day 1991, the red Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the very last time. The Cold War was over. But here's the question I want to leave you with. Did that global contest over freedom, power, and ideas actually end? Or are we just living in the next chapter of the very same story?